an organizational failure. If we ask where social capital comes from, it has a lot of different sources. In a traditional society, kinship is very important, shared culture, things like a common religion. And then in all societies, repeated interaction is a source of trust. That is to say, if you have repeat dealings with another individual and that individual acts honestly in the past, you are going to expect that they will be honest in the future. They may not be, but compared to somebody that cheats you at the first opportunity, you're going to gravitate towards cooperation with the person that was honest and reliable rather than the one that was dishonest. And so therefore, iterated interaction tends to generate social capital, and that is an explanation for why trust oftentimes is the strongest. Bonding is the strongest in small homogeneous groups, within families, in neighborhoods, among close groups of friends, where people have been able to watch the repeated interaction of individuals and draw conclusions in terms of trust from that. In modern societies, social capital has other sources. It comes from education, particularly professional education. If you are educated as a lawyer, a doctor, an architect, a software engineer, you have norms that you absorb. You don't just absorb skills, but you absorb a certain norm of service to a broader community. Shared goals and standards generally tend to create norms and norm-following behavior. And finally, leadership. Within a small organization or within an organization, individuals at the top can set common standards, they can inspire people, they can create organizational cultures. It's harder to create social capital on a society-wide basis, but certainly on a micro level within an individual organization, that is one of the key functions of leadership. The final important issue involved in the design and the proper functioning of organizations has to do with how to delegate. So let's return to the point I made earlier in this lecture, which is to say the central issue in organizational functioning, proper organizational functioning, is a question of delegated discretion. Delegation is necessary. No set of rules, so for example, you don't necessarily have to delegate. You can try to control your agents through a detailed set of instructions. The problem, as I think everybody who's worked in an organization understands, is that no detailed set of rules is ever sufficient to cover all possible circumstances, all future scenarios, and therefore you need something more than that. You need to delegate the judgment to actually react to your local surroundings. And I think that one of the dysfunctions of bureaucracies, in fact, that drives most people crazy about bureaucracies, is in fact that they've got too many rules, that they've got tiny little nitpicking rules for this and that somebody has forced on the bureaucracy, or sometimes that bureaucrats themselves prefer to have these detailed rules. And they do that in a sense to avoid responsibility. They don't want to actually have to exercise judgment, and so they would much rather protect themselves by saying, well, I'm simply following a rule from upstairs. And conversely, the guy upstairs may not want the agent to use their own judgment and therefore will try to circumscribe their behavior in that way. The second reason, again, that delegation is necessary is that oftentimes expertise, it's not just local knowledge, as we said earlier, but expertise lies in the lower levels of the organization. So the person that's really going to know how to create the right kind of engine valve is not going to be the vice president, sitting in corporate headquarters. It's going to be the engineer that spent his or her whole life working on that particular set of problems. And then finally, it's that expertise combined with local knowledge that I think makes it completely necessary in most organizations to do a high amount of delegation to the lowest levels of the body. But then the question arises, can you trust the agents? Now, one of the interesting conundrums in thinking about the problem of political corruption is that many of the solutions in developing countries that have been proposed for the problem of corruption is to limit discretion, that is to limit the amount of judgment that you will delegate to low-level agents. Robert Klitgaard, who is one of the great experts on corruption, in fact, has a little formula that says that corruption is equal to discretion minus accountability. That is to say, corruption, the agent doing something that the principal doesn't want, occurs when the principal allows the agent to exercise discretion and then fails to hold them responsible for their actions. And so the question is, how do you build trust in government? How do you build trust in the private sector? Is Klitgaard's formula to remove agent discretion necessarily the course that you want to follow, since this is in fact the advice that is being given to many poor and transitioning countries at the present moment by international development organizations? In my view, the degree of bureaucratic autonomy should resemble an inverted U a little bit like the graph that you see in front of you. That is to say, if you have bureaucratic autonomy from little autonomy to a lot of autonomy, the right point to be in order to get the best quality decision-making out of a government organization is somewhere at the peak of that curve. That is to say, if you have too little autonomy, agents cannot exercise independent judgment. They follow mindless rules. They're unable to adjust to new circumstances. On the other hand, if they've got too much autonomy, then they stop doing what the principal wants, and they violate the basic purpose for which they're appointed as agents. And in fact, historically, we've had a number of bureaucracies that have gone off the rails. The German military before World War II, before World War I, or the Japanese military in the 1930s are examples where the agent basically drove the principal. That is to say, the group that should have been delegated responsibility for implementation actually ended up setting policy. And so you want control by the principal of the agent, but you don't want too much control. You don't want micromanaging and excessive dictation by rules. Now, this then allows us, I think, to understand why it is that different countries actually need different approaches to the question of how much autonomy to delegate. And I think this shows why Klitgaard's assertion that you need to limit discretion is in fact true. It's true for a certain set of countries, but it's not a universally true rule. The graph that you see in front of you shows you 4 possible levels of bureaucratic capacity from low to high. And in my view, the amount of autonomy that you'd want to delegate would depend really on the level of capacity. And so therefore, in a country with relatively poorly trained, poorly educated, poorly trained bureaucrats, you do in fact want to follow the Klitgaard rule and limit the amount of discretion because they actually don't have the ability and the incentives to exercise independent judgment. That is to say, if you pay police officers nothing and you give them very little training, what are they going to do? They're going to take bribes. On the other hand, if you've put them through a very rigorous course of professional training, you pay them in a way that shows respect for the kind of prestige that a professional really deserves, then they're going to behave better and you're going to be able to trust them with more authority. And by the way, this is true not just in the public sector, it's true in the private sector as well. Corporations delegate enormous amounts of authority to lower levels of their organizations, and they do it according to their judgment of how much capacity those agents have to actually use that authority responsibly. And that explains why you would want to limit the discretion in a very poor, corrupt country, but you would want to actually increase discretion, let's say in a rich country in an agency that was staffed by a lot of PhD-trained professionals. So if you think about autonomy and capacity as separate dimensions, you can have a up-down axis, a y-axis from high capacity to low capacity, and a degree of discretion from excessive delegation to excessive subordination. And there's probably a sweet spot that corresponds to high capacity and the appropriate degree of delegation. But as you get less capacity, you're going to want to delegate less autonomy. If we put some actual countries into this, it's very hard to actually measure the degree of autonomy in any given country because we don't measure things like that typically. At least we don't measure them terribly well. You might put a number of countries in the matrix in the following fashion, where bureaucrats, let's say in China, have a great deal of discretion. They're not bound by that many rules because there's a very weak rule of law in that country. They have, a middling amount of capacity, and so it does not end up as disastrously as a country, let's say like Nigeria, that has very low capacity in most parts of its bureaucracy, but probably delegates way too much autonomy to the government that then is in a position to take bribes, to steal, and the like. Using this framework, we can see that there are different paths to reaching an optimal degree of autonomy. So a country like China that operates with very few or relatively few rules needs more of them. On the other hand, I would argue that a country like the United States, which I think is in many instances excessively rule-bound, needs to be able to delegate more. And a country like Nigeria that does suffer from very high endemic rates of corruption needs to increase or decrease the amount of delegated discretion much more dramatically. And of course, everybody needs to move up the y-axis in terms of getting greater state capacity. Let me conclude by talking about how it is that you bring about policy change, because this is an important way that we bring together many of the different ideas that are being discussed in this and other lectures. So there's a technocratic approach to policy change. It says that bad policies are the result of ignorance or just not knowing what the right thing to do is, and that you need to look around the world for best practices and import them. This is the getting to Denmark model that in a sense assumes that Denmark is a great place, low corruption, good democracy, high levels of wealth. So all you have to do is copy Danish institutions and you'll be off to the races. And this is something that has been tried in quite a number of countries, and frankly, it's an approach that doesn't work terribly well. I would say that in place of this approach, what we need to think about more is a political approach. Bad policies don't happen because people are ignorant. They happen because there are vested interests that want to keep things that way. That is to say, if there's corruption, if there's resources being diverted from the government, it's not because people don't understand that somehow you're not supposed to do that. It's because they're profiting from it. And because you've got a structure of incentives that allows them to get away with that. And therefore, bad policies exist because they serve existing vested interests. And unless you can change the incentives of those vested interests, you're not going to be able to change the policy. And that requires us to think politically. That is to say, how do we displace existing power holders? How do we gain power for ourselves in order to be able to change the institutional rules? When you deal with political constraints, you need to think about stakeholders. A stakeholder is simply anybody that's got an interest in the particular issue you're talking about, whether it's providing better municipal water to an Indian city, or whether it has to do with eliminating informality in a city in Latin America. You need to think about who the critical stakeholders are, and you need to figure out what their fundamental interests are. What incentives do they face that will affect their behavior? Or rather, changing their incentives, how do you change their incentives in ways that will affect their behavior? The vested interests can be within the bureaucracy, and they can also be within the broader political system. They can be in the legislature, in the other parts of the executive branch. They can be in civil society. They can be among voters. And what you need to do is to begin to think about coalitions for change. You need to decide, you need to locate stakeholders in three groups. The first group are people that are your allies, people that have some interest in bringing about the change that you want. The other group are entrenched stakeholders that do not want change, that want to block you, that want to stop you. And then in every case, there's going to be a group in the middle, people who are neutral, indifferent. They could be on your side or they could be on the opponent's side, and it's kind of up in the air. What you need to do is figure out how to bring about a coalition of the people that are on your side right from the beginning. And then you need to have a strategy to deal with the entrenched stakeholders. You have to identify them, you have to figure out what their interests are, and you have to be able to figure out either how to neutralize them politically or how to change their preferences. And if you can change them, you have to figure out how to, buy them off or do something else that will eliminate their opposition to the change you're trying to bring about. The group in the middle, in many instances, is the really critical one, and that's where communications plays an important role. Many economists begin with an assumption that preferences are fixed, but as we know, they're not. People can be convinced of things. They can be persuaded by good arguments, by evidence, by appeals to emotion. And that's basically what politicians do. Politicians are trying to change people's preferences all the time. And if you're trying to operate in a reform situation, and you need to change the neutral into positive supporters, you need to figure out a communication strategy by which that can happen. So to conclude, I think that organizational change, improving the quality of government, does not follow a standard template. You cannot go to best practices in any given country, Denmark or wherever else, and simply import that model. You need to understand the specific environment that you are operating in. That environment is technical, it's political, it's cultural, it involves a tremendous amount of local knowledge. And you need to derive the solutions from concrete problems. If you do not begin with a concrete problem, you will not have an incentive to solve something. If you and the people around you do not recognize that what you are dealing with is something that is problematic, that is to say it's costly, it's not working well, it's making people unhappy, then you could solve things in the abstract, but you'll never generate the political incentives to do that. All solutions need to be iterative. That is to say, nobody ever gets the right solution right the first time. And in fact, some of the most successful reformers were ones that kept going back, kept modifying their goals, kept modifying the approaches until they found one that works. And that, in the end, is one of the conditions for leadership. It's being able to understand all of these dimensions of bringing about change, to motivate people, to communicate, to build the coalitions, to neutralize the opponents, and to bring that all together into a single package. So thank you very much for listening. This has been a lecture on how to improve the quality of government from the Leadership Academy for Development.